So I'm on day two, I guess I'd call it step two, of trying to make sense of the Rayshard Brooks situation in Atlanta. Just because it's kind of top of news right now, and it's the most timely, most relevant event that's happened with it. And also, as I mentioned in the prior video, and a lot of people have mentioned, it's a situation that we can learn from. So if we can learn from it, we should spend time on it. We should examine it, and not rush, right? I said it in the last video. Don't revert to simplicity. Don't, think you've got it figured out. Take the time. And part of taking that time, as I mentioned, is understanding the broader context, the situation of the Atlanta PD, of the particular officers, of Rayshard Brooks, the details of the situation, obviously, but the context beyond the situation still really matters a lot. So I've had, some more conversations about it. I've thought more about it. I've watched the video, a few more times. And the thing that came to my mind, because the approach I'll usually take in a situation like this, just to give a little bit of my approach, my mindset, is I typically try and get the facts first as best I can. So in a situation like this where there's actually a video, watch the full video a few times. There's other videos, but the main video is about 43 minutes. Watch the other videos. Try and read, as best I can, kind of legitimate, objective news on it. And then I'll start to branch out to the more subjective news, right? The media that is known to be a little bit more biased in either direction. And I do that actively, I would say. When I say actively, I'm doing it fully knowing and aware that these media outlets are typically a little bit more biased, and that's okay, right? There's debatable if it's okay, but as long as you know it, I think it's okay. Everybody has bias, but I do it actively in that I'm trying to actively stop my mind from hearing a story or, a narrative that it starts to feel like, okay, I've got this figured out. Like, that makes sense, that's the story. So you have to be active in that to say, hey, I want to see what that truth looks like for somebody. I want to see what that narrative would look like if it was clearly police brutality, if the cops were clearly wrong, and this is just another instance of a black man being, hunted and murdered in the street. I want to see what that story looks like. I want to hear from those people what the narrative is in their head. Fully aware, fully active in that to say, I don't want to just adopt that. I want to understand it. I want to see that perspective. Same thing on the other side. For people that believe, hey, this guy resisted arrest. This was a good situation in which the cops did their job. They tried to be respectful. Their life was threatened. Horrible that somebody was killed, but, no way is it the cops' fault. I want to hear that. I want to see that perspective. I want to understand it. I want to empathize with it. I want to take all that in, right? Because I want to try and understand this unbelievably complex situation with as much input as I can. And as much as you may disagree with either of those sides, they're inputs. Each bit of how they assessed that situation and came to their conclusion, it's relevant. It's relevant because maybe it's something I didn't think of that I can look at and say, maybe that gives me a new insight on the situation, not just blindly adopt it, but assess it. So it's relevant for that reason, but it's also relevant because if the goal in this is to try and actually make a change and try and prevent this, you need other people. It can't just be an individual exercise where I determine what I think happened and that's all that matters. At the end of the day, that's pretty useless. Having conversations, affecting change is what the goal should be. So to do that, you need to understand the different mindsets. You need to understand the different audiences you might be getting involved with. So I've spent a lot of time doing that. And the thing that stands out for me today as I look at it, and I'll digress for a second, but I'll come back. There's a phrase that you'll hear in sports, particularly in mixed martial arts, the UFC. I've heard it a lot recently, and I think the current welterweight champion, Kamaru Usman, was the one that kind of coined it, but I'm not positive on that. But that's who I've heard say it the most. And what he'll say to people is, keep that same energy. That's kind of one of the lines he says a lot. Keep that same energy. And what he means by that, when he's saying it, is oftentimes, he'll be getting ready to fight somebody, and the fighter will be doing an interview, and be talking trash about Usman, and he's going to do this, he's going to do that to him, and if he ever saw him in person, he would kill him, all that type of stuff. And then what Usman would say is then they'll come together for like a press conference or something. And all of a sudden when they see each other backstage, that person isn't the same. They're not saying the same things. They're not keeping that same energy, right? So what he'll often say to people is like, hey, keep that same energy, right? If that's all the trash you're talking, when you see me in person, keep that same energy because I'll respect you more. And that's fine if that's, where your head is or what you believe. And let's, we'll see what happens. But don't do this thing where you say it in one setting and then you see me or you come and, then all of a sudden it's all respectful and nice and all that. Keep the same energy. So that phrase, I always liked that phrase. I thought it was clever. I thought it was interesting. In a different application, but I think it applies in this situation. I've talked in prior videos about the importance of consistency in our thinking, in applying the same frameworks, the same standards when we're assessing a situation to try and be objective, right? Don't let those biases seep in. Don't let subjectivity seep in and have you look at two situations, but assess them differently. Read two articles, but depending on which newspaper it came from, one you trust, one you don't. If the set of facts are the same, that's what should matter. So I think in this case that becomes relevant because I'm seeing it on both sides where you'll hear people and forget about the fringes, forget about the extremes for a second, but you'll hear people who by and large, I think, want to believe and do believe for themselves that they want things to get better, right? On both sides. So you'll have people on the right normally who will say like, hey, listen, I'm all for police reform. Maybe it's debatable how systemic racism is in the country, but, we should try and stop police brutality. There probably is some race issue in the police force and we should try and fix that. And it's probably complex, but we should do the work, right? We shouldn't just hide behind the shield and just say all cops are good. There's some problems there. We need to address it, right? And on the left side, you'll have people that'll say, listen, I know there's good cops. I know there's times in which, the cop's job is tough and bad things happen and their life is in danger and things happen, right? It's not a perfect world. That stuff does happen. I get that, right? I still think we should try and fix it and try and do things, but I understand that sometimes, circumstances are just bad and they just go wrong, right? So you have those kind of two views. My point to both those sides is keep that same energy, right? I know a situation like this is super emotionally charged. It's easy to get caught up. It's easy for you to, revert to simplicity or have your biases seep in or just feel so passionate about the topic to feel like you see it and you know what it is. But you need to recognize, right, if you're not keeping that same energy. So look at that same thing we were just saying about that person on the right? I want to see police reform. I understand, right? I believe most cops are good, but there's some problems we need to fix it. When a situation like this happens, what I see a lot of people on the right doing is being quick to say everything those cops did was right. That was completely Rayshard Brooks' fault. He was drunk, he resisted arrest, he stole the taser, and all that's true, right? And all that's true. But if what you said before is true, that, hey, I believe our cops are good, but there's still room to improve. We want to see reform. We want to see things get better that might be more subtle, that might be more complex because it is a complex situation. Keep that same energy. In this situation, don't just revert to saying, hey, I need to protect the cops and those cops are good and those cops are fine. Don't play defense. Keep the same energy. Use this as a situation to say, hey, here's what I think happened, right? I think this is why it happened. I think the Rayshard Brooks in this situation made these mistakes for sure, but here's maybe some things the cops could have done differently. Now I get the fear in that. There's fear of, liability and litigation and all these things. So people's tendency is to get defensive because they feel like it's a battle. Somebody's got to break that, right? You got to keep that same energy and say, hey, in good faith, I'm looking at this situation and I'm not just going to kowtow to the other side's views, but I'm going to keep the same energy and apply the same framework and say, hey, maybe there's things the cops could have done better. Same thing on the other side, right? Horrible situation. Nobody wants to see Rayshard Brooks dead. Everybody would probably agree that's reasonable that he shouldn't be dead, right? But as we said, that kind of left argument is that we know there's good cops. We know sometimes situations just get out of hand, they get out of control. Keep that same energy. Don't jump to the conclusion that this was just racist cops killing a black man, right? Recklessly. Maybe it was, as we've talked about, right? We don't have all the context yet, but keep that same energy. Entertain the possibility that this just went wrong. Could there be things the cops could have done better? Sure, there always is, right? Is there things Rayshard Brooks should have done differently? Absolutely, without a doubt. So keep that energy. When you assess the situation, do it in that way, right? Like, listen, this isn't cut and dry. This isn't blatant, but there may still be a problem that we want to work through. But let me build credibility in this almost. Let me keep that energy and say I'm applying the same framework. I understand sometimes there's difficult, complex situations like this. So let me not jump to a conclusion. Let me not just be the loudest voice yelling for something, even though it's so emotional and you're so passionate about it. Keep the energy, that rational, level-headed energy, to try and actually affect change, to try and actually have a conversation with the other side. Because when you don't, right, when you totally change the tune because the event or the situation is such that it's so emotionally charged, or it feels so personal to you, or you feel like you need to play defense, all that happens is everybody starts playing defense and nothing changes. It's a stalemate. So keep that same energy. Apply consistent frameworks when you assess situations like this, and take your time to really understand what happened before jumping to those conclusions, before jumping to certainty.